In the summer of 1825, an unknown artist named Thomas Cole borrowed $25 to make a painting trip up the Hudson River to the village of Catskill Landing, 90 miles from New York City. From Catskill, Cole hiked 12 miles west to where the Catskill Mountains rise abruptly more than 3,000 feet above the floor of the Hudson Valley. Cole spent several weeks in the Catskills making drawings and painted sketches of the trees, waterfalls, and lakes of this extraordinary mountain wilderness. Later, back in his New York studio, Cole turned the drawings and sketches into 3 landscape paintings, which he put up for sale in the window of a frame shop on Lower Broadway. John Trumbull, history painter and director of New York's prestigious American Academy of Fine Arts, spotted the 3 paintings in the frame shop window. Trumbull bought one of the pictures. He then persuaded 2 other well-known artists, William Dunlap and Asher Durand, to buy the remaining 2. The 3 paintings cost $25 each. William Dunlap immediately sold his painting for $50 to Philip Hone, mayor of New York and the city's leading art collector. Feeling guilty for not having passed on his profit to the young artists, Dunlap, who was also an art critic, wrote a glowing review of Cole's work for one of New York's leading newspapers. From that time on, wrote Asher Durand, Cole's fame spread like fire. His pictures sold as fast as he could paint them. Thomas Cole's landscapes had obviously touched a romantic nerve in the American public. The Hudson River School had just begun. The Hudson River School was America's first homegrown, coherent, and sizable group of landscape artists. Thomas Cole and his immediate followers regarded the unspoiled American landscape as a direct manifestation of God. They approached nature with reverence, portraying it with the detailed care of a naturalist. These artists studied together, traveled together, and all of them worked or lived along the Hudson River or in the Hudson Valley. The Hudson River School occupied the center of the American art stage from the 1820s until the 1870s and 80s, when it was cast aside as tedious and unfashionable. What was so remarkable about Thomas Cole's discovery and sudden success was that in 1825, landscape painting was considered an inferior art. Only 1 painting in 10 was a landscape. The rest were historical paintings, portraits, still lifes, and genre scenes. But by 1850, when the Hudson River School was enjoying the peak of its success, 9 out of 10 paintings on the gallery walls were landscapes. Before Thomas Cole, most of the views of the Hudson River were provided by explorers, military draftsmen, and travelers. In 1680, a Dutch minister named Jasper Dankerts made this drawing of New York while he was waiting for a passport to travel up the river to Albany. In 1780, Charles-Pierre L'Enfant, the French officer who designed the street plan for Washington, D.C., made this topographic drawing of the encampments at West Point during the Revolutionary War. In 1801, Charles Wilson Peale painted this watercolor of West Point looking north, past Breakneck Ridge and Storm King Mountain. Thomas Doughty, who painted the Hudson only a few years before Cole, was the one artist who might have claimed Cole's mantle as the founder of the Hudson River School. But his paintings were criticized for their blandness and repetitiveness. His pictures, when compared to Cole's, looked more European than American. Thomas Cole's paintings were unmistakably American. When the first settlers landed in New England, the American landscape was one vast, unbroken forest, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. For 200 years, the goal of the American people was Western movement and the civilization of this forbidding wilderness. They called it Manifest Destiny. Thomas Cole's romantic paintings of the Catskill Mountains were the first to allow Americans to see the beauty of their own wild landscape. Thomas Cole was born in Lancashire, England in 1801. At the age of 18, he sailed with his family to America. He lived and worked on the frontier in Ohio and western Pennsylvania before moving to Philadelphia, where he studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. In the spring of 1825, Cole traveled to New York to join his family at their house on Greenwich Street. It was that spring that Cole made his first trip to the Catskill Mountains. In the fall, at almost the same time that Cole's pictures were discovered by Trumbull, Dunlap, and Durand, New York City celebrated the long-awaited opening of the Erie Canal. DeWitt Clinton, governor of New York, led a flotilla of barges from Buffalo through the canal to New York City, where he poured a keg of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean. By linking New York Harbor with the Great Lakes and the grain fields of the Middle West, the Erie Canal made New York City America's leading seaport. Between 1825 and 1850, New York tripled in population. New business meant new patrons, and new patrons meant a need for artists and engravers. In the autumn of 1825, artist members of the American Academy formed a drawing association, which a year later became the National Academy of Design. In his book, American Landscape Painting, Wolfgang Born writes that 1825 was a year that seems to be a turning point in American taste. If New York City was to provide the marketplace for the Hudson River School, the Catskill Mountains were to provide its inspiration. Washington Irving describes the Catskills in his story, Rip Van Winkle. The interior of these mountains is in the highest degree wild and romantic. Here are rocky precipices mantled with primeval forests, deep gorges, and savage glens rarely trodden by the hunter. In the first of his leather stocking tales, James Fenimore Cooper has his hero, Natty Bumppo, say, "You must have seen them on your left as you followed the river. There's High Peak and Round Top above all the other hills. But one of the ridges, where the rocks fall for the best part of 1,000 feet, the river is in sight for 70 miles, like a curled shaving under my feet." Here on the ledge, described by Cooper's hero, Thomas Cole painted the Catskill Mountain House, the Hudson Valley's favorite hotel. Only a day's ride by steamboat from New York City, a trip to the Mountain House became as obligatory to continental tourists as a trip up the Rhine. It was South Lake, behind the Mountain House, that was the inspiration for one of Cole's first paintings, Lake with Dead Trees. Cole painted two pictures of nearby Caterskill Falls, one from the mountain opposite the falls, and the second from inside the cave beneath the falls. He painted the Caterskill Clove from the rocks above Haynes Falls, looking out toward the Hudson River 12 miles in the distance. In the summer of 1827, Cole took lodgings in the village of Catskill. He spent the fall and winter hiking and sketching in the mountains. It was here that he developed his practice of making drawings and taking notes on colors, distances, and atmospheric conditions. Cole rarely painted directly from nature. In a letter to Asher Durand, he wrote, "I must wait for time to draw a veil over the common details, the unessential parts, which shall leave the great features, beautiful or sublime, dominant in the mind." In his painting Last of the Mohicans, Cole seems torn between his devotion to the natural, mountainous landscape and his desire to tell Cooper's story. In the years to come, this storytelling message of Cole's pictures would become predominant. In 1829, Thomas Cole sailed for Europe. He spent 2 years in England, where he exhibited his pictures at the Royal Academy and met artists whose works he admired, like John Constable and J.M.W. Turner. Cole traveled to France and Italy, where he resided amid what he called the desolate sublimity of the Italian ruins. Ruins like these of Tivoli suggested to Cole the perishability of the works of man, an idea that would consume him for the next 4 years. When Cole returned to New York, the collector Luman Reed commissioned him to paint The Course of Empire. The theme of the 5 canvases was the rise and fall of a great civilization. The beginning of civilization was the savage state. The second stage was the cultivation of the land, or the pastoral state of man. With cultivation and trade began the rise of the great city-state, the apogee of civilization. Then, with decadence, came conflict and the destruction of the city. And finally, the ultimate state, desolation. The cycle is complete. Civilization has returned to Cole's earlier vision of Tivoli, the desolate sublimity of the ruins of man. When this gloomy message was exhibited in 1836, the reaction of the public was mixed. Cole felt that the response was unfavorable, even though he collected more than $1,000 in exhibition fees. James Fenimore Cooper wrote, "Not only do I consider The Course of Empire the work of the highest genius, but one of the noblest works of art that has ever been wrought." In 1836, Cole married Maria Bartow and settled permanently in this house in Catskill. Disappointed by the public's reaction to his Course of Empire, Cole began again to paint landscape. In a letter to Luman Reed, he wrote, "Fancy pictures seldom sell, and they generally take more time than views. I have commenced a view from Mount Holyoke." Although Cole painted this picture mainly to earn money, he felt dissatisfied with being, as he termed it, a mere leaf painter. "I have higher conceptions," he wrote Durand, "but I am out of place." After a sketching trip to Scroon Mountain in the Adirondacks, Cole wrote, "We emerged from the forest and our eyes were blessed. The hoary mountain rose in silent grandeur, its dark head clad in a dense forest of evergreens, cleaving the sky, a starry pointing pyramid." In 1837, Cole painted the mountains from the village of Catskill to preserve the scene the way it looked before the recent incursion of the railroad. "If men were not blind to the beauty of nature," he wrote, "the great works necessary for commerce might be carried on without destroying it." In 1839, Cole began a second series of paintings called The Voyage of Life, a romantic journey from childhood to youth to manhood and finally to old age. The Voyage of Life was one of Thomas Cole's most popular works. After a second trip to Europe in 1841, Cole returned with a renewed enthusiasm for the American landscape. It has its own peculiar charm, he wrote, a something not found elsewhere. I am content with nature. Would that I were with art. Toward the end of his life, many of Cole's pictures were devoted to religious subjects. Thomas Cole died in 1848 at the age of 47. At his funeral, his friend, the poet William Cullen Bryant, gave the oration. What an enthusiasm was awakened by these early works of his, which carried the eye over scenes of wild grandeur, peculiar to our own country, over the aerial mountain tops with their mighty growth of forest, never touched by the axe, along the banks of streams, never deformed by culture, and into the depths of skies, such as few but Cole could ever paint, and through the transparent abysses of which it seemed that you might send an arrow out of sight. A year after Cole's death, Asher Durand was commissioned to paint Kindred Spirits, a commemorative picture of Cole and Bryant standing on the ledge at Fawn's Leap, said to be one of Cole's favorite haunts in the Catskills. When Asher Durand first met Thomas Cole in 1825, Durand was 29 years old and already famous as the country's foremost engraver of banknotes and art reproductions. When Cole died in 1848, Durand became the nation's leading landscape painter, as well as the new leader of the Hudson River School. Durand began his career as an apprentice engraver. At the age of 24, he received the coveted commission to engrave John Trumbull's painting, The Declaration of Independence. In his book, That Wilder Image, James Flexner writes, when President Jackson closed the Bank of the United States in 1836, he unwittingly created what were to be the nation's major art schools. The proliferation of private banks, each one printing its own banknotes, meant an enormous demand for new engravers and engravings. Had you thrown a handful of pebbles into any major workshop, you would have hit 2 or 3 future painters. For years, Durand had tried his hand at the occasional landscape. Of landscape painting, he wrote, "The simple truths of nature constitute the true religion of art." By the late 1830s, thanks to the commissions of Luman Reed and the encouragement of Thomas Cole, Asher Durand was able to devote himself exclusively to landscape painting. He confessed to Cole that he considered himself a trespasser on Cole's ground, but not a poacher. He said he was not a poacher because his landscape technique was entirely different from Cole's. While Cole made sketches and notes, which he later combined into painted compositions, Durand would go directly to the spot he wanted to paint. He then allowed the landscape in front of him to form his compositions, and the weather and atmosphere to determine his color and light. In 1840, Durand and 3 other engravers, John Kensett, John Casselier, and Thomas Rossiter, made the grand tour of the European galleries. In England, Durand was impressed by the naturalness of John Constable's landscapes. In France, he became aware of the poetic atmosphere of Claude Lorrain. In 1855, Durand wrote a series of articles for the Crayon magazine called Letters on Landscape Painting, in which he summed up the ideology of the second generation of the Hudson River School. Durand urged the aspiring art student to go forth under the open sky and list to nature's teachings. And when you have learnt to imitate her, you may then study the pictures of the great artists with benefit. Atmosphere, he wrote, carries us into a picture instead of allowing us to be detained in front of it. It spreads over all objects the color of which it receives from the sky and sunlight and cloud light. Durand wrote, "Fine color was the concealment of pigments and not the parade of them. It is neither warmness nor coolness that elicits admiration, but harmony and subordination of means." Letters on landscape painting became the aesthetic conscience of the second generation of Hudson River School artists. That picture is ideal whose component parts are representative of the utmost perfection of nature, and also the most perfect arrangement or composition of these parts so as to form an equally perfect whole. Durand's letters can be compared to Emerson's essay on nature, in which he says, "A leaf, a drop, a crystal, a moment in time is related to the whole and partakes of the perfection of the whole. Each particle is a microcosm and faithfully renders the likeness of the world." Durand's long career stretched from the beginning of the Hudson River School to the school's decline in the 1880s. Asher Durand, who was 5 years older than Thomas Cole, outlived him by 38 years. Durand died in 1886 at the age of 90. Directly across the Hudson from Thomas Cole's house in Catskill, Cole's pupil, Frederick Church, built his spectacular home, Olana. Described by a contemporary as thoroughly Persian, provincialized only when necessity demanded it, Olana reflected Church's success as the only Hudson River artist to take his landscape vision to the jungles of South America, the icebergs of the North Atlantic, and to the temples of Greece and the Near East. Church, who became Cole's student at the age of 19, showed prodigious talent for learning Cole's technique of making sketches and noting colors and atmospheric conditions. Cole said that Church had the finest eye for drawing in the world. Church's exotic travels were inspired by the theories of Alexander von Humboldt, who wrote of the South American jungles, "What might not artists of the future do, inspired by the wider horizons, the nobler and grander forms, and the luxurious fullness of life in the tropical world?" In 1853, Church and his friend, the inventor Cyrus Field, retraced von Humboldt's trip through the jungles of Ecuador, enduring enormous hardships along the way. When Church returned to America, he completed from sketches his first South American composition, the Andes of Ecuador. Niagara Falls was Church's first heroic North American subject. Niagara was the first painting to be a single attraction at a New York commercial gallery. Thousands flocked to see it in 1857. One reporter exclaimed, "This is Niagara, with the roar left out." And another writer called it the grand characteristic object of American scenery, the majestic symbol of unceasing life and irresistible progress. When Niagara was shipped to London, it was favorably reviewed by John Ruskin, and the London Times wrote that while America has had a literature, it is now attaining a school of art. After a second trip to South America, Church exhibited Heart of the Andes in New York. In a single day in the spring of 1859, 2,400 people stood in line at Church's 10th Street studio to pay 25 cents each to view the picture in its theatrical setting of black drapery, hidden gas lights, and potted palms. Visitors were urged to look at details of the painting through tubes provided for the purpose. Of Heart of the Andes, the New York Times commented, "It is not like Niagara, one moment in nature, but like the noblest works of Claude and Turner. You must look upon it long and often." Heart of the Andes was probably seen by more people in less time than any other picture painted before the Civil War. In 1862, after the war had broken out, Church exhibited his third South American painting, Cotopaxi. One reviewer, reflecting the painful mood of the time, commented that the sun in the painting is scarce able to pierce the war clouds. By following von Humboldt's idea that art reveals a deep memory of the whole creation, Church may have intended Cotopaxi to express hope for the recreation and regeneration of the country at the war's end. Church's life after the Civil War was not easy. After losing 2 children to diphtheria in 1865, he traveled to the islands of the Caribbean, where he painted Rainy Season in the Tropics. He spent 1.5 years in Europe, the Near East, and Greece, where he painted this picture of the Acropolis. Church's travels were largely a period of mourning. After the completion of Olana in the 1870s, Church was afflicted by crippling arthritis and rarely painted large landscape pictures. Toward the end of his life, he painted small sketches of the river and the Catskills from Olana. By the time Frederick Church died in 1900, the Hudson River School had been out of favor for 20 years. When a memorial exhibition was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art the same year, a critic commented that his paintings were vistas of the Earth's anatomy that belonged in a traveling show. Albert Bierstadt's gigantic canvases of towering mountains, vaporous skies, and plunging waterfalls became a metaphor for the last American frontier. His paintings echoed the sentiment of the time that the American West promised a brilliant and harmonious development of the entire nation. Bierstadt, who was born in Germany and raised in Massachusetts, returned to Europe to travel in Italy and Switzerland, and to study at the Dusseldorf Academy, when its precise painting style was having its greatest following among artists both in Europe and America. Bierstadt was at Dusseldorf at the same time as 2 other American artists, Worthington Whittredge and Emanuel Leutze. 2 years after returning to America in 1857, Bierstadt signed up with Colonel Frederick Lander's expedition to survey an overland wagon trail to California. Bierstadt, who took a photographer with him, painted a band of Shoshone Indians from sketches and photographs made on the trip. In a letter to the crayon, Bierstadt wrote, "The manners and the customs of the Indians are still as they were hundreds of years ago, and now is the time to paint them, for they are rapidly passing away, and soon will be known only in history." Bierstadt returned to New York before the Civil War and settled into the 10th Street studio building. After visiting one of the Union Army camps during the war, he painted Guerrilla Warfare, which he presented to the Century Club in New York City. Toward the end of the war, New York held a huge painting exhibition to raise money for the United States Sanitary Commission, the forerunner of the American Red Cross. At one end of the Great Hall hung Leutze's Washington Crossing the Delaware. Dominating the walls on opposite sides were Church's Heart of the Andes and Bierstadt's The Rocky Mountains. A critic compared the paintings of Church and Bierstadt. Neither artist manifests any grand conception of nature nor appreciation of its poetry. Another critic commented that while the Dusseldorf manner had infected Bierstadt, he is recovering from the disease. The Rocky Mountains sold for the staggering sum of $25,000. It was the most expensive painting of its time. In 1866, Bierstadt built Malkasten, his mansion and studio on the Hudson. Malkasten, which means paint box in German, was named for the Artists' Club in Dusseldorf. Here he painted the domes of Yosemite, 9.5 feet high and 15 feet across. When this picture was exhibited, a critic for the New York Tribune wrote, "Mr. Bierstadt seems to be under the delusion that the bigger the picture, the finer it is." By 1876, when America held its first centennial exposition, the critics were beginning to grow tired of Bierstadt's large Western landscapes. One commented that Bierstadt's paintings had lapsed into sensational and meretricious effects. His Last of the Buffalo was rejected by the Paris exhibition of 1889, only a few years after Malkasten had burned to the ground. Bierstadt declared himself bankrupt in 1895. The style of his pictures had not changed. They had merely gone out of fashion. John Kensett, like Asher Durand, began his career as an engraver, and like a number of the other artists of the Hudson River School, he decided to study painting in Europe. Kensett is shown here in a picture by Thomas Rossiter in their studio in Paris, where Rossiter is seated at the easel. Kensett is standing behind him. Other artists in the picture are Asher Durand, Daniel Huntington, and Thomas Cole. It was in England that Kensett decided to devote himself to landscape painting. "My real life commenced there," he wrote, "in the study of the woods of Windsor and the beaches of Burnham." Kensett came home in 1847 and settled into a studio in New York City. He was one of the best-loved artists of the Hudson River School. Kensett was described by Henry Tuckerman in his 1867 Book of the Artists as of the most thoroughly amiable disposition, wholly superior to envy. He pursues his vocation in such a spirit of love, a critic must be a very hard material to say a severe, inconsiderate, or careless word about John Kensett. During the Civil War, Kensett helped to organize the Great Sanitary Fair exhibition. A year later, he became one of the founding trustees of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, along with Frederick Church and Worthington Whittredge. In 1864, he was commissioned by members of the Century Club to paint Mount Chocorua in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Like Durand, Kensett made notes and painted sketches during his summer trips to the mountains or to the coast. The notes and drawings would then be turned into completed oil paintings in his New York studio. In 1863, he painted View from Cozzens Hotel, looking south from West Point. His view from Fort Putnam, looking north from West Point, is the same one that inspired Charles Willson Peale 60 years earlier. Lake George in the Adirondacks was one of Kensett's favorite subjects, which he painted in all kinds of weather. Kensett's interpretations of American light have linked him with the Luminist painters, Fitzhugh Lane and Martin Johnson Head. In his later years, Kensett painted views of the inlets and marshes near his studio in Darien, Connecticut. The extraordinary series of pictures done during the last year of his life has been called one of the lasting monuments of the American Luminist style. John Kensett's life was ended abruptly in 1872 when he died of pneumonia a few days after trying to retrieve the body of a friend from the waters of Long Island Sound. Jasper Francis Crospey was the only Hudson River painter who was an architect as well as an artist. Crospey lived at Hastings-on-Hudson in this house from 1885 until his death in 1900. The studio was built from his own designs. Crospey wrote of his childhood, "I was born on Staten Island in 1823, the oldest in a family of 8 children. I was sent to such schools as the neighborhood afforded. The seeds of my art were there implanted. I was so disposed to adorn my writing book in the margin that I would undergo the reprimand of the teacher rather than desist from it." A mechanical model that Crospey made of a farmhouse won him a diploma from the Mechanics' Institute and an apprenticeship to a Manhattan architect. He left the architect's office when he was 20 to concentrate on his painting. Of his paintings, Crospey wrote, "I felt the want of nature in my pictures, so I set off for the country, up in the Jerseys in Orange County. From this time, my pictures began to put on some of the robes of nature and breathe a little of its breath. From one of these sketches, I produced me much reputation. It was a view with Greenwood Lake in the distance. This was exhibited in the National Academy, and on its merits, I was elected an Academy member." By 1847, Crospey's paintings brought him enough success to marry and embark upon a 2-year wedding trip to England and the continent. In Rome, the Cropseys lived in a studio which they later discovered had been the studio of Thomas Cole. After their return to New York in 1849, Jasper took a studio on White Street. Crospey traveled and painted from the Hudson Valley to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, to the Green Mountains of Vermont, and the Adirondacks of New York. In a review of Cropsey's landscapes, a critic observed that the axe of civilization is busy with our old forests. Yankee enterprise has little sympathy with the picturesque, and it behooves our artists to rescue from its grasp the little that is left before it is ever too late. After attending a performance by the Swedish singer Jenny Lind at Castle Garden in Manhattan, Crospey presented her with a painting of the concert hall in appreciation of her talent. "It was Thursday, the 5th of June. I remember it well," he wrote. "It was about 3 o'clock and the bell rang. I ran to the door and, opening it, there was a lady, richly dressed. She looked familiar to me. She entered with a smile and with a voice inimitable said, 'You do not recognize me, Mr. Crospey.' As I was about to pronounce her name, she said, 'Miss Lind.'" In 1856, the Crospey family sailed again for England, where they were to remain for 7 years. American landscapes were popular in London, and Crospey's pictures were much in demand. He became friends with John Ruskin and shared Ruskin's view that art, religion, and nature were inextricably intertwined. In London in 1860, Crospey exhibited Autumn on the Hudson. 9 feet across, it was the largest painting he had attempted. The London Times considered the picture a companion piece to Church's Heart of the Andes, which had been exhibited in England the year before. English critics were skeptical of the brilliant color of the leaves in Crospey's picture. He sent home for real autumn leaves and had them pasted on the wall next to his painting. Thanks to Ruskin, Crospey's work gained a wide audience in England, and in 1861 he was presented to Queen Victoria. In 1863, the Cropseys arrived back in New York a day after the Battle of Gettysburg. 2 years later, Crospey painted the Valley of the Wyoming in Pennsylvania, a scene of peace and prosperity after 4 years of the violence of war. After the war, Crospey designed and built Aladdin, a 20-room house and studio not far from Greenwood Lake. Perhaps his best-known architectural designs were the passenger stations of the 6th Avenue L. These stations were landmarks for New Yorkers from 1876 until they were torn down in 1939. During the last 15 years of his life at Hastings, Crospey painted intimate pictures of the Hudson. He described one of his paintings of the Hudson Highlands. "That magnificent passage of scenery, about 90 miles from New York, where the river narrows and seems in the course of time to have wrought its way through these stubborn hills to seek the distant waters of New York Bay. This view is taken from the high ground about a mile below Newburgh. The high mountain on the right is called Storm King. Polypel Island is in the middle of the river, and the high hills on the left form the gates of the Hudson. I was born in Ohio in 1820. My boyhood was spent on my father's farm near Springfield. So begins the autobiography of Worthington Whittredge. I left home after I faithfully promised to learn a trade. Already I had a longing, I know not from where it sprang, to be an artist. I made my way to the home of a sister in Cincinnati. Her husband was a sign painter. My brother-in-law set me at it immediately. In a little while, I was painting pictures on hose wagons, as well as temperance banners. I painted a landscape, which I sent to the National Academy in New York. I had the intense satisfaction of hearing this picture was hung in the exhibition. This was a great encouragement to me. In 1849, Whittredge went to Europe. I went to Barbizon, where I heard several young landscape painters had set up a sort of school. I liked the spirit of these young men, but I did not think much of their pictures. When Whittredge arrived in Dusseldorf, Emanuel Leutze was working on his Washington crossing to Delaware. Whittredge recalled that Leutze found great difficulty in finding American types for the heads and figures. I was seized and made to do service twice, once for the steersman with the oar, and again for Washington, clad in full uniform. When Whittredge returned to America after 10 years in Europe, he wrote, "Frankly, I doubt the desirability of long foreign study. We are looking and hoping for something distinctive in the art of our country. It was impossible for me to shut out from my eyes the works of the great landscape painters I had so recently seen in Europe. If I was to succeed, I must produce something new, inspired by my own surroundings. I hid myself in the recesses of the Catskills. The forest was a mass of decaying logs and tangled brush. No peasants to pick up every vestige of fallen sticks. No well-ordered forests. Nothing but primitive woods with their solemn silence reigning everywhere." At the close of the Civil War, I was invited by General Pope on an inspection tour of the Rocky Mountains in New Mexico. I had never seen the plains or anything like them. Whoever crossed the plains at that period could hardly fail to be impressed with its vastness and silence. Nothing could be more like an Arcadian landscape. A landscape painter is only at home when he is out of doors. It matters not whether he is an impressionist or one of the older school. We all have different eyes and different souls, and each is affected through these mediums. That all sorts of impressions are received and all sorts of work is produced is only saying that all sorts of artists are at work. One of these artists was Sanford Robinson Gifford. Whittredge wrote of Gifford in his autobiography, "My acquaintance began with Gifford soon after he commenced his career as an artist. I once asked him how it happened that he chose the study of art. He replied, 'I don't know, it happened so,' and this was as far as I could get." After Gifford left Brown University and returned to his home in Hudson, where his father was in business, he was pressed to choose some occupation. Betwixt his desire to please his father and to please himself, he found himself in doubt. He started off one morning for the top of Mount Marino, overlooking the river. On the opposite side lay the village of Catskill. There was one house standing in the village, around which we may believe there was a halo of light. This was the house of Thomas Cole. It was not long before Gifford's name began to appear in the catalogs of the Academy of Design. As Whittredge recalled, I met him first on the Rhine at Drachenfels, which had been the subject of a recent picture of mine. I was a little nettled that he should take so little interest in the place. If I remember rightly, he said that no historical interest attached to landscape could help the landscape painter, that he must go behind all this to nature as it had been formed by the Creator, and find something there which was superior to man's work. We were told that he was born in Saratoga County. As an artist, he was born in the Catskill Mountains. The particular part of the Catskills which pleased Gifford best was the region round the mountain house, overlooking the Great Plain and the Hudson River. When sketching, he preferred the fleeting effects of nature. He would stop in his tracks to make sketches, always suspicious that if he stopped too long, the most beautiful thing of all might pass him by. After Gifford's death, his friend and fellow artist John Ferguson Weir wrote, "He rendered atmosphere palpably, with great delicacy. His finest impressions were when the air was charged with an effulgence of eruptive and glowing light." Gifford loved the glories of the declining day. In 1879, S.G.W. Benjamin, author of Art in America, wrote, "The first landscapes of George Inness properly belong to the early and distinctly American school of landscape, while his recent method has identified him with the later graduates of the ateliers of Paris." George Inness, who was born in Newburgh in 1825, gave up a career as an engraver to study landscape painting. After seeing the paintings of Cole and Durand, Inness said there was a lofty striving in Cole, and Durand a more intimate feeling of nature. If, thought I, these two can only be combined, I will try. Inness went to Europe several times in the 1840s and 50s, where he discovered the Barbizon painters of France and moved away from his earlier admiration of Cole and Durand. When he returned to America, he struggled for recognition. His paintings were not acceptable to New York art buyers. He moved with his family to Boston, where his pictures began to sell. Inness applied the broad techniques of the Barbizon painters to his own mystical view of nature. According to his son, he seldom painted directly from nature. He would study for days, creating the composition from his own brain, but with so thorough an underlying knowledge of nature that the keynote of his landscapes was always truth and sincerity. If we grant that all American art grew to a greater or lesser extent out of European impulses, then the example of Inness and those he influenced, like Homer Martin and Alexander Wyant, shows the influence of the Barbizon and Impressionist schools winning over the precise painting styles of Rome and Dusseldorf in New York studios. Inness wrote, "Never put anything on your canvas that isn't of use. Never use a detail unless it means something." George Inness's paintings were an early manifestation of this major change of taste that shook the American art world and put the Hudson River School out of business. In 1888, Clarence Cook published his massive survey, Art and Artists of Our Time. Of Thomas Cole's paintings, he wrote, "They intended to convey moral teaching in a would-be poetical symbolism." He wrote that Durand was an influence on the younger men of his times with his minute and scientific study of natural forms. Church's pictures, he said, were more to be praised as records of famous places than as works of art. By the end of the century, Thomas Cole and Asher Durand were almost forgotten history. Cosmopolitanism had overtaken the American art scene. The younger artists wanted to pursue new avenues, working in the Barbizon and Impressionist styles. Collectors put off the old style and put on the new like a suit of clothes. Cole and Durand were considered naive. The later artists preferred to see paint for its own sake. Technique assumed a role of being as beautiful and as admirable as the content. Today, that attitude is commonplace, and taste is now swinging back to the romantic vision of the mid-19th century. As the Hudson River School is being reappraised, we can see that the vision of its artists has endured. Much of the Hudson Valley looks the same today as it did in the 19th century when they painted it. The river is cleaner now than it was 30 years ago. It seems that we are finally beginning to believe in the beauty of our own landscape. As Thomas Cole wrote despairingly after the railroad invaded his beloved village of Catskill, "This was once my favorite walk, but now the charm and solitude is gone. However, man cannot remove its craggy hills, nor well destroy its rock-rooted trees. The rapid stream will have its course." Today, more than a century has passed. Man can remove the craggy hills. He can destroy the rock-rooted trees, and man can change the course of the rapid stream. Today, if we stand on any of the spots along the river where these artists used to paint their pictures and look at the river through their eyes, we can see what Carl Carmer meant when he wrote, "True progress involves preservation of the people's inheritance of their scenic, historic, and recreational values. I believe that ugliness begets ugliness, and I know that nature's beauty, once destroyed, may never be restored. I would offer to our children the same beauty our fathers offered us a century ago."